In the heart of a bustling African city, Accra, the newly opened Silver Crescent Mall hides a secret no one could ever imagine. In the city lived a woman named Nadine. She adjusted her handbag strap as she stepped into the cool, air-conditioned mall. Silver Crescent Mall was alive with energy. Parents hurried after their children, couples walked arm in arm, and groups of teenagers laughed near the food court. She smiled faintly as she moved through the crowd, though the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The mall had become her refuge, a place where she could escape from the silence that filled her home. She wandered, letting the noise and activity distract her from the ache inside. Nadine was the kind of woman who lit up every room she entered, her laughter a melody that people couldn't help but hum along to. She had always been the kind of person with a plan. Growing up in Accra, she had worked hard to become one of the top interior designers in the city. Her career flourished, and she met Kofi, a charming and talented architect. Their love story seemed perfect, the kind people admired and envied. Their wedding was beautiful, their future bright. But life didn't always follow plans. For 3 long years, she and Kofi had tried to have a child. At first, they had been hopeful, thinking it was just a matter of time. But as the months turned into years, their hope began to fade. Doctors offered no clear answers. Unexplained infertility, one had said, as if that would make the pain easier to bear. Kofi was supportive, always reassuring her that their time would come, but Nadine saw the sadness in his eyes. It was in the way he avoided the baby section at stores, the quiet sighs when another friend shared their pregnancy news. She blamed herself, even though no one had ever said it was her fault. Now, the mall was her escape. She often came here, watching the busy families and imagining a different life. Today was no different. She ordered a latte and found a seat near the coffee kiosk. As she sipped her drink, her eyes followed a young mother trying to calm a fussy toddler. Nearby, 2 little girls chased each other, their laughter ringing out. Nadine felt a familiar tug at her heart, a mix of longing and pain. As she sat lost in thought, a faint sound reached her ears. It was soft, almost drowned out by the noise of the mall. She frowned and tilted her head, trying to catch it again. It sounded like a baby crying. She looked around but couldn't see where it was coming from. Shrugging it off, she returned to her coffee. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. Her curiosity was piqued. Leaving her coffee behind, Nadine followed the sound. It led her to a quiet corridor she hadn't noticed before. The bright lights of the mall faded behind her as she walked down the dim hallway. At the end was a plain door marked storage. She hesitated. The crying sound was coming from behind the door. Her heart beat faster. Why would a baby be in a storage room? She glanced over her shoulder. The hallway was empty. Taking a deep breath, she reached for the handle. It was locked. She stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of her wanted to walk away. Maybe she was imagining things, or maybe there was a simple explanation. But another part of her, the part that had spent years longing for a child, wouldn't let it go. "I'll come back," she whispered to herself. Turning away, she walked back toward the lively mall, but her mind was already spinning. What was behind that door? And why did it feel like she was meant to find out? As Nadine began visiting the Silver Crescent Mall more frequently, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. The vibrant atmosphere that once provided her with solace began to feel increasingly unsettling. It wasn't the laughter of children or the bustle of families that caught her attention. It was the quiet moments, the fleeting glances between certain individuals, the hushed conversations that vanished when she walked by. One evening, while taking her usual walk through the mall, Nadine noticed a young mother with a baby, looking distraught and hurried, speaking to a well-dressed woman in the corner of a high-end boutique. The exchange seemed brief, but the desperation in the mother's eyes made Nadine pause. She couldn't hear the words, but the woman's hand rested on the baby's tiny head as the mother handed over a small envelope. The transaction appeared almost clinical, as if it had been rehearsed. Curiosity gnawed at her. Nadine decided to start paying closer attention. She began returning to the mall at different times of day, observing the interactions between mothers and some of the more affluent-looking women in the area. What she uncovered was more horrifying than she could have imagined. Some women, often young, impoverished, or isolated, were approached by seemingly well-intentioned individuals who offered to help them in their time of need. These women were coerced into giving up their babies in exchange for promises of money, gifts, or promises of a better life for their children. The women, who believed their children would be raised in loving homes or given opportunities they couldn't provide, were manipulated into signing away their rights to their own flesh and blood. One instance stood out. Nadine overheard a conversation in the food court between two women, one of whom had just given birth. She learned that a woman named Mercy, who ran a small, upscale maternity store in the mall, had been offering young mothers up to 5,000 cedis, along with promises of helping them get back on their feet. Nadine listened as the young mother, a recent graduate with a child she couldn't afford to care for, tearfully expressed how she had signed over her parental rights to Mercy, hoping for a better future for her child. Nadine's heart ached as she realized how systemic and insidious the scheme was. But unraveling it wasn't going to be easy. Every time she tried to follow a lead or approach a woman she suspected might be involved, something always seemed to obstruct her. Either the women vanished before she could get close, or she was warned off by the mysterious figures who seemed to be watching her every move. On one occasion, as she took a photograph of Mercy's store, a man in a dark suit confronted her, asking why she was taking pictures. Nadine, startled, quickly deleted the image and made an excuse about wanting to design the store's layout for an upcoming project. Determined to get to the bottom of the dark underworld she had uncovered, Nadine continued her investigation, but it became clear that the deeper she dug, the more dangerous it became. She received anonymous threatening messages on her phone, messages that warned her to stop asking questions. She also started seeing unfamiliar faces around the mall and in the streets near her office. It was as if she was being followed. Still, Nadine pressed on. She used her design work as a cover, arranging meetings in various parts of the mall to gather information, all the while keeping her suspicions under wraps. But every revelation seemed to lead to more questions, and soon, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that hung over her. This wasn't just about uncovering a scandal, it was about bringing to light something far darker and more dangerous than she had imagined. What Nadine didn't realize was that the people behind the operation were more powerful than she had thought, and they were willing to go to great lengths to silence her. Nadine's investigation had reached a boiling point. She was no longer just a passive observer, she was a woman on a mission, determined to expose the dark secrets of the Silver Crescent Mall and the horrific scheme to sell babies. But the deeper she delved into the web of deceit, the more she realized just how deep and dangerous this operation truly was. It had started innocently enough, an offhand conversation here, a suspicious encounter there, but now Nadine was fully entrenched in an underworld that no one could have imagined. Every lead she followed only led to more questions, and every question seemed to make her a target. The chilling realization struck her that this was bigger than one or two rogue individuals. This was a network of powerful, influential people who had been operating in plain sight for years. The wealthy women who had approached vulnerable mothers were only part of the scheme. There were doctors, lawyers, and even high-ranking government officials involved. People who could make problems like Nadine's disappear with a single phone call. At first, Kaydee had been supportive, not fully understanding the extent of what she had stumbled upon. When Nadine first brought it up, she kept her suspicions vague. "There's something not right about the mall," she had told him one night, over a quiet dinner. "I feel like I'm uncovering something dangerous." Kaydee had listened attentively, his brow furrowed with concern, but he had trusted her instincts. He encouraged her to continue her investigation, promising that they would face it together. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Nadine's life started to unravel. She began receiving cryptic threats, her phone buzzing with anonymous messages at all hours. One message simply read, "Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Another warned her, "Leave it alone, or you'll lose more than just your peace of mind." But Nadine's resolve only strengthened. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back. Her next big breakthrough came when she managed to gain access to the maternity boutique owned by Mercy, the woman at the center of the baby-selling operation. Nadine had befriended one of the shop assistants, a young woman named Jessica who seemed troubled by the work she was doing but felt trapped by her circumstances. Through subtle conversations and well-placed questions, Nadine learned that Mercy wasn't working alone. She had connections, high-ranking officials who ensured that any mothers who were hesitant about selling their babies were coerced into compliance. There was a network of influential people that provided a constant supply of babies for wealthy clients who were either infertile or looking for children they could adopt discreetly. Jessica had confided in Nadine one afternoon, as they were alone in the back of the store, the air thick with tension. "It's not just the money," Jessica had whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "There's more to it. I've seen them, the people who come in, offering more than just money. They give promises of connections, power. I don't know what's going on, but I think it's dangerous." One of the women who was supposed to take a baby, she disappeared. Just vanished. Nadine's heart raced as Jessica's words sank in. Disappearances? The implications were terrifying. It was then that Nadine knew she had to act quickly. But she also realized that exposing these powerful figures would require more than just a well-timed interview or an anonymous tip. It would take something much more drastic. In the days that followed, Nadine began to reach out to the other women she had identified as victims. Some had agreed to speak with her in hushed tones, their faces drawn with shame and guilt. One woman, Beatrice, had been coerced into giving up her newborn son, a child she had planned to raise in a small village outside Accra. She explained that she had been offered a substantial sum of money, which she used to pay off her debts and start a new life. She had been told that her son would be adopted by a loving family. But when Beatrice asked for proof that her child had been placed in a safe home, Mercy's team had grown hostile, telling her to keep quiet or face the consequences. Nadine's determination burned brighter as she met with these women. Each victim's story added another layer to the complexity of the operation. But Nadine wasn't just collecting stories. She was weaving a narrative, piecing together the tangled threads of corruption and greed that were strangling the lives of these vulnerable women. Kofi's support was unwavering. He helped her navigate the dangerous waters she was treading. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, her mind racing with plans and strategies, and Kofi would sit with her, offering a shoulder to lean on. He suggested they work together to gather concrete evidence, photographs, recordings, and documents, anything that would help expose the ring. However, the further Nadine ventured into this darkness, the more dangerous it became. She began to receive personal threats. One evening, as she walked back to their apartment from a late meeting, a black car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and a man's cold voice echoed from inside. "You're getting too close," he warned. "Stay away from this, or it won't end well for you." Fear threatened to paralyze her, but Nadine refused to let it. She was determined to bring justice, not just for the women, but for the babies whose futures had been stolen from them. Kofi had become her anchor. His encouragement and quiet support were the lifelines that kept her moving forward. One fateful night, Nadine and Kofi decided to confront the source of the darkness. Armed with the evidence they had gathered, photographs of Mercy's dealings, recorded conversations with Jessica, and testimonies from the mothers, they made their move. They sent a carefully worded email to a trusted journalist, one known for his investigative work on corruption in Ghana. The email contained everything they had gathered, with a promise to meet in person the following day to discuss the next steps. What happened next would change everything. As they prepared to meet the journalist, Nadine's phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "You thought you could expose us," the voice sneered. "You're in over your head." The call ended abruptly, and Nadine felt the cold grip of fear tighten around her. They were no longer just investigating an illicit operation, they were on the cusp of exposing a much larger, more dangerous force. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out, and Nadine and Kofi had committed to seeing it through, no matter the cost. As the investigation into the baby-selling ring continued, Nadine and Kofi grew increasingly determined to bring the operation down. But as they gathered evidence, the stakes only seemed to rise. The closer they got to uncovering the full scope of the operation, the more dangerous it became. They were up against powerful individuals with connections in every corner of society. But Nadine knew that this was no longer just about her, it was about saving the innocent lives that had been caught in this terrible scheme. One day, while reviewing the evidence they had compiled, Nadine received an unexpected phone call from Amora, a journalist she had met a few weeks earlier during one of her covert trips to the mall. Amora had been following the story closely and had noticed an odd pattern in the behavior of certain high-profile mall-goers. She had quietly observed that wealthy women were being ushered into the mall's restricted top floor, an area that had been closed off for renovations. Initially, it seemed innocent enough, just another section of the mall being refurbished, but Amora's instincts told her otherwise. She had heard whispers, saw glimpses of secretive meetings, and noticed the way certain figures moved in and out of the area, always with a sense of urgency. "Meet me at the Silver Crescent Mall tonight," Amora urged. "I've found something. We need to act fast." Nadine's heart raced. She had always felt the pull of something dark in the mall, but she had never imagined it could go this far. That night, Nadine and Amora met in a secluded corner of the mall. Amora's eyes were wide with fear, and she spoke in hushed tones, scanning the area to ensure no one was listening. "I think I've uncovered the worst part of it all," Amora said. "There's a secret auction. It's happening on the top floor. They've been auctioning off babies to the highest bidders." Nadine's stomach churned. The idea of what was happening in the building above them felt like a violation of everything sacred. But Amora wasn't just speculating, she had proof. Using her connections in the press, Amora had received tips about an underground market where wealthy families could bid on babies. The operation wasn't just a shady adoption racket, it was a full-fledged auction where human lives were treated as commodities. Nadine could barely process the magnitude of it. This wasn't just about selling babies, it was about the destruction of families and the exploitation of the most vulnerable members of society. Amora had managed to get a few photographs of the top floor, taken covertly with her phone. They showed groups of well-dressed individuals gathered in a dark room, where infants in cribs were displayed like prized objects, their future already determined by the highest bidder. It was a horrifying sight that made Nadine's heart ache for those children. "This is the final piece of the puzzle," Nadine whispered, barely able to control her anger. "We have to expose this." But Nadine knew that they couldn't do it alone. This was too big, too dangerous. They needed help, and they needed it fast. As fate would have it, one of the employees who worked at the mall, a young man named Kwame, had been quietly observing the auctions and had grown disturbed by what he'd seen. He had heard rumors from colleagues and noticed how the top floor was being kept off limits to the rest of the mall staff. His conscience had driven him to approach Amora after hearing her speak about the investigation during an offhand conversation in the food court. Despite his fear of the consequences, Kwame had agreed to help them. "I can get you to the top floor," Kwame said, his voice trembling. "I'm part of the cleaning crew, and I've seen it all. But we need to move fast. They're watching everyone now." With Kwame's help, Nadine and Amora carefully devised a plan. Amora would act as a distraction, luring a few of the key players into a different part of the mall. Meanwhile, Nadine and Kwame would access the top floor and capture footage that would be undeniable evidence of the auction taking place. The night of the operation, Nadine's heart pounded in her chest. She knew they were taking a huge risk, but this was their last chance to expose the truth. The top floor was eerie in its silence, an oppressive weight hanging in the air. As Kwame led her through the back stairwell, Nadine's mind raced with thoughts of the families who had been destroyed, the children who had been stolen. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had suffered in silence, just like the women she had met during her investigation. When they reached the top floor, Nadine's breath caught in her throat. It was worse than she could have imagined. The room was lit by dim, flickering lights, and rows of babies in bassinets were lined up in a sterile, impersonal fashion. Several wealthy couples sat at a table, whispering amongst themselves as they eyed the infants. There was an unsettling calmness to the scene, an atmosphere of cold calculation. Kwame, who had become visibly uncomfortable, handed Nadine a small video camera. She silently began recording, her hands shaking. The footage would be their ticket to bringing this operation to light. But just as she began to capture the evidence they needed, the door to the room creaked open. Suddenly, they were caught. A man in a sharp suit stormed into the room, his eyes narrowing when he saw them. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is your final warning." But before anything else could happen, Amora's plan came to fruition. She had already alerted the authorities, and in the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The police, with the help of a few brave journalists, stormed into the mall and raided the top floor. Several of the individuals involved in the auction were arrested, but not without a struggle. The mall's dark secret had been exposed, and the operation was finally shut down. But the aftermath was not without its consequences. Nadine and Amora were both hailed as heroes, but the threats against them didn't stop. Nadine received more anonymous calls, warnings that they would never be safe. The powerful figures behind the auction were not easily deterred, and some of them managed to evade capture, slipping into the shadows to regroup. For Amora, the weight of the investigation weighed heavily on her. She had faced a difficult choice in exposing the truth, one that would come with emotional scars. The auction had been her breaking point, and now she had to live with the knowledge of how many lives had been affected by her choices. As for Nadine, the victory was bittersweet. She had uncovered the darkness that had plagued the Silver Crescent Mall, but it had come at a high cost. The price of truth was more than she had ever imagined, and the scars from this journey would stay with her for a long time. But one thing was clear: Nadine and Amora had changed the world in ways they would never fully comprehend. They had brought light to the shadows, and in doing so, had given a voice to the voiceless. In the aftermath of the operation's success, the dust slowly began to settle. The Silver Crescent Mall, once a symbol of opulence and secrecy, now stood as a place of both relief and lingering tension. The baby trafficking ring had been dismantled, but the shadows it left behind would take time to fade. Nadine, Amora, and all the brave souls who had risked everything for the truth knew that their battle had only just begun. The operation's exposure had sent ripples through the nation, and while some perpetrators were held accountable, others remained elusive, their influence far-reaching. The haunting realization that similar operations could exist in other corners of the country loomed over them. But amidst the chaos, there were moments of healing, moments of hope that helped soften the blow of everything they had uncovered. For Nadine, the most significant change came in the form of a baby, one of the infants who had been rescued from the auction. Her journey to motherhood, one that had been riddled with pain and heartbreak, found its resolution in this small, innocent life. She had always dreamed of being a mother, but after years of struggle and loss, she had resigned herself to the idea that it might never happen. Yet, as fate would have it, one of the babies that had been part of the trafficking operation was placed in her care. The child, a little girl named Adoma, was found with nothing but a tattered blanket and a note written in a foreign hand. The police had worked quickly to reunite children with surviving relatives or to place them in safe homes, but there were some babies, like Adoma, who had no one. Nadine, with her heart wide open, volunteered to foster her. The first time Nadine held Adoma, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The long months of uncertainty, of prayers unanswered, seemed to melt away as she gazed into the tiny face of this child, who had been rescued from the cruelest circumstances. Nadine couldn't erase the pain of her past, but in this child, she found a bittersweet resolution to her own longing for motherhood. With Kofi by her side, they began the process of adoption. In time, Adoma would become their daughter, the answer to all of Nadine's unspoken hopes and dreams. For Amora, the journey was more complicated. She had played a crucial role in the operation's success, but her personal life had been forever altered by what she had witnessed. Amora's story was one of both triumph and heartache. After the bust, she was able to reunite with her child, a son she had been separated from during the chaotic months leading up to the investigation. He had been staying with his grandmother during the most dangerous parts of the operation, and when Amora finally returned to him, their reunion was filled with tears of joy. However, the scars of the ordeal were not easily healed. Amora found herself wrestling with the emotional toll of everything she had seen. The trauma of uncovering the baby auction weighed heavily on her, and she struggled with the pain of knowing how many families had been torn apart. The bond between her and her son was strong, but the invisible wounds from the experience would take time to mend. She sought therapy, spoke with others who had been affected, and leaned on her support system, including Nadine and Kofi, who had become close friends throughout the investigation. For both women, the path forward was about rebuilding, not just their lives, but the lives of the children they had fought for. Nadine and Amora often spent hours together, reflecting on what had happened, sharing stories of hope, and raising awareness about child trafficking. The fight was far from over, but their determination had been sharpened by the lives they had touched and the courage they had found in themselves. As the Silver Crescent Mall reopened with tighter security and increased vigilance, there was a sense of victory in the air, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the forces behind the trafficking ring were far from eradicated. Whispers of similar operations in other parts of the city, and even in other countries, reminded them of the work that still lay ahead. The battle against human trafficking was a war, not a single fight, and the road to healing would be long and arduous. But for now, Nadine found solace in her family. She cherished the quiet moments with Kofi, Adoma, and even the memories of their hard-fought journey. She often looked at Adoma, her heart swelling with love, and wondered how this tiny soul could heal the wounds that had taken years to form. Kofi, too, found peace in the new chapter of their lives. The road to parenthood had been long and difficult, but together, they had built something beautiful and lasting. Nadine and Amora had both faced unimaginable challenges, but in the end, they had found redemption in the most unexpected places. They had fought for justice, and in doing so, they had reclaimed pieces of their own lives that they had once thought lost forever. The shadows of the past would always be there, but Nadine had learned that love, resilience, and the courage to stand up for what's right could drive out even the darkest of forces. As they walked away from the Silver Crescent Mall one final time, the sun setting behind them, they knew the fight for justice was far from over. But they were no longer just two women alone in their struggle. They were warriors, bound by the unbreakable bonds of friendship, motherhood, and the hope that, together, they could make a difference in a world that still had so much to heal.